We have 2 minutes left, and I'm going to take a look here because I can't always see everyone. But Miss MacKenzie Grow, one of my favorite people in the world, a recent graduate of UCLA, Master's in Public Health, and our project administrator for the Social Change Institute, will be moderating this panel. I am excited to lift her up and introduce her for this next segment. Miss Grow.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Can everyone see my presentation on the screen?
Yes.
Awesome, perfect. Okay. Well, hello and welcome to our panel, Millen-Z Voices, Navigating Wealth and Equity as Women of Color. As you just heard, my name is MacKenzie and I'll be hosting the panel today. I'm super excited to be closing out our event with the amazing discussion we're about to have. And again, welcome. So I'm going to start by posing a poll question to the audience, and then I'm going to lay out some context for why we're here and the unique relationship between wealth, equity, and the Millennial and Generation Z cohorts. And then we're going to move right into a discussion with all of my fantastic co-panelists that you see on the screen right now. So I'm going to pull up that poll really quick. And this may be your first time hearing Millen-Z, but take a stab at it. What would you define Millen-Z as? Once I get a few votes, we'll move right on. Okay, I have a few answers there. So my most, let's share that, I can share it. The most response was for B, those born after 2000. So let's see if you were right. All right, so if you answered A, you'd actually be right. Those born since 1981 are considered millennials. Millennials are defined as being born between 1981 and 1996. And in 2020, they're aged 24 to 39. So the oldest millennial right now is nearly 40 years old. And I don't think everyone realizes that. Those born after 1996, sometimes referred to as post-millennials, which you might see on some of the charts that I have coming up, are considered to be of Generation Z. While no chronological endpoint has been determined as far as I saw in all my research, it looks like that generation will probably end around 2011 or 2012, based on how previous generations have been defined. But as far as some population stats, millennials have officially surpassed baby boomers as the nation's largest living adult population as of last summer. And lastly, as of 2017, 40% of the workforce was comprised of Millen-Zs, 35% millennial, and 5% post-millennial or Generation Z. So we are the rising majority in the workforce. So why Millen-Z? Why are we talking about these two generations together? Well, while it may be premature to say with certainty how the views of Generation Z will evolve, research shows that both they and millennials look very similar on key social and political issues. So if we use the 3 indicators on the slide, Millen-Zs hold views that differ significantly from the older generations. Only about 3 in 10 Gen Zers and millennials, 30% and 29% respectively, approve of the way Donald Trump is handling his job, compared with 38% of Gen Xers and 43% of boomers, and over half of the silent generation. On a similar note, majorities in Gen Z and the millennial generation say that the government should do more to solve problems, whereas Gen Xers and boomers are more evenly divided on the issue. And when it comes to race, the 2 younger generations are more likely than older generations to say that Black individuals are treated less fairly than whites in the United States, and they are much more likely to support the recent protesting of NFL players against police brutality compared to their older, the older generations. Lastly, the 2 younger generations, Millen-Zs, are more accepting of some of the ways in which American society is changing. Majorities of Gen Z and millennials say that increasing racial and ethnic diversity in the US is a good thing, while older generations are less convinced. Further, not surprisingly, millennials and Generation Z are more likely to have positive views of interracial and same-sex marriages than their older counterparts. So some more key characteristics. Based on a 2018 Pew report, Gen Z is not only the most racially and ethnically diverse generation seen yet, as illustrated in the chart on the slide, but they're also on track to be the most educated generation yet. Even though most are still in K through 12, the oldest Gen Zers are enrolling in college at a higher rate than millennials were at the same age. But according to researchers, racial and ethnic diversity isn't all that's driving the attitudes that we saw in the previous slide that differ so much from older generations, because these generational differences remain consistent and significant among non-Hispanic white Millen-Zs as well. So as you see on my bullets, Gen Z Republicans are more likely than older generations of Republicans to say that Black individuals are treated less fairly than white individuals. And further, Gen Z Republicans are more likely than their older counterparts to say that the government should both do more to solve problems, and they're more likely to attribute the warming climate and climate change to human activity versus natural like phenomena or something that is just supposed to be happening. So some education characteristics. As I said before, Millen-Zs are the most educated cohorts as compared to older generations. And as the share of young adults with college degrees continues to climb, it is clear that Millen-Zs spend more time and resources navigating higher academia. If we look at this graph, we can see that about 39% of millennials aged 25 to 37 have a bachelor's degree or higher, compared with just 15% of the silent generation, about a quarter of boomers, and 29% of Gen Xers when they were the same age. So lots of involvement in higher ed and pursuing college degrees. So key characteristics, debt and wealth. Unfortunately, in today's context, more education often means more borrowing and more debt. Millennials appear to have accumulated slightly less wealth than older generations had at the same age, and this can partially be attributed to differences in debt by generation, according to the research we have right now. Compared with older generations, more millennials have outstanding student debt, and the amount of it that they owe tends to be greater. So the share of young adult households with any student debt doubled from 1998, when Gen Xers were 20 to 35, to 2016, when millennials were of that same age. So millennials of the same age have about double millennials have debt as compared to Gen Xers of the same age, and the median amount of debt was 50% greater. And so as we see, the generations are getting more ethnically and racially diverse and more educated. The diversity and as the generations become composed of more people of color, there are specific implications to this, especially as it does pertain to wealth and equity. As older millennials transition into adulthood within the unstable economic conditions caused by the Great Recession in 2018, Black young adults during that time were disproportionately impacted by the continued high rates of unemployment, and they had slower job growth post-recession as compared to their other millennial cohorts. Further, data shows that Black millennials have acquired more education debt, and the repayment of that debt is much slower than that of their white and Latinx counterparts. While there are a myriad of explanations for these observations, high-cost loans, discriminatory practices, not only in lending, but in hiring, and unequal wages are among the most significant. So you can see in the table that Black and Latinx millennials are much more likely to take out loans for their education, and they're more likely to borrow more. This is likely due to the racial wealth gap that exists in the United States, which we've been talking about, for the last few days, which requires Black borrowers particularly to need to pay more for college and, of course, borrow more for college. We'll stay right here for a second. So that's my little spiel, just laying that context for what we're about to talk about. And I hope that this helps to situate issues of wealth and equity within the context of the world that Millen-Zs have before us. And I hope you all learned something new. But I'll be sure to share the links to the research that I cited throughout, so you can all take a look at that more deeply if you'd like. And I would like to also now welcome my co-panelists into the discussion. I'm going to let them, I'm sorry at this, I'm just gonna stop sharing. I don't want to go that far, but I'm excited to let them introduce themselves and then answer an icebreaker question or two, and then we can get right into the discussion. And I'd also like to say as a little disclaimer that we're not trying to essentialize the Millen-Z experience or speak for the, potentially hundreds of millions that are represented in those two generations. But we do understand that the emerging leaders that are on this panel face unique challenges and circumstances as we grow older and participate more fully in the world. And before I ask my partners to introduce themselves, I would love to give a shout out to one in particular, Ms. Kahlila Williams, who, hot off the press, has just been recognized for all of her great work in organizing by People Magazine's Girls Changing the World in 2020. I saw it today and I just lit up. I'm so very proud and excited that Kahlila was able to join us today, and all that she's put into this work, not only on the panel, but the organizing that she does on the ground is super important and super inspiring. So with that, I'd like to have my co-panelists unmute themselves, and if you could just give everyone your name, your title, your affiliation, and a quick look into the work you do, and if you could answer my icebreaker, what does being a Millen-Z mean to you?
Hi everyone, my name is Jennifer Molina. I am a research associate at Boston Medical Center. I am from San Fernando Valley, but I'm currently working at Boston Medical. Our work, we're just finishing up one of our studies, which focused on working with mothers who had children with special healthcare needs. So a lot of our work, my work was baselining mothers, a lot of which were Black, Latinx mothers, who were from low-income communities out in Boston, which a lot of were Dorchester, Mattapan, Roxbury, and Chelsea. And currently we are doing a lot of work with COVID. So we are trying to reach out to all of our pediatric patients and trying to connect them with the resources that they need at this time. And again, I'm super honored to be sharing space with all of you.
Thanks, Jenny.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jasmine Guevara. I am the Associate Program Officer of the Cedars-Sinai Community Benefit Giving Office, which is Cedars-Sinai in and of itself is a nonprofit, and we get to do a really cool job in that our work helps fulfill that nonprofit mission, so we kind of function as the philanthropic arm of the health system. And I am also very, very grateful to be here. Jenny and I went to high school together, so it's kind of funny to be in a very different life moment together still. And I'm very, very grateful also to CHC for creating this space and seeing the value in youth voices that I know Michelle and I have talked about and means so much and gives me so much optimism. And to MacKenzie, who has done so much work wrangling the four of us for the last 2 months.
Thank you, Jasmine.
Hi, my name is Kahlila Williams. I'm an activist with Students Deserve and Black Lives Matter Youth Vanguard. And I work to reimagine public safety and stop the over-policing in Black communities, as well as remove police from schools and defund the police in schools and beyond schools.
Thanks, Kahlila. And congrats.
Thank you.
It's tough to follow that. I'm Grace Song. I'm a senior policy analyst here at CHC. I work with Diane on our policy analysis and research, as well as our legislative efforts within LA, as well as at the state level and some federal policies as well.
Thank you, Grace. All right, we're gonna get right into it. We're doing kind of like a view podcast format for our discussion. So I'm gonna post a question and hopefully hear from all my panelists, and then we'll move into the next question and continue like that. So the first question that I have for my panelists here: how does your identity influence the way you understand wealth, equity, and their intersections?
I can kick us off with that one. So this is a really fun one, even just for us to talk about as a panel, because we do have very, very different backgrounds and are in very different spaces at the moment. But I am Salvadorian by heritage, but I definitely see myself as this kind of cohort of new American. So they're not very deep roots my family has here, but they're quite strong. We're kind of here for the long haul. So that's had a big influence on how I wrestle with being, you know, a SoCal resident who really by extension identifies with being an American, and then also thinking about how devalued so many of our communities are in the prowess that the United States has historically had. So especially speaking from like the Latinx community, we have played such an enormous part in what leads to wealth creation. We kind of, a lot of the jobs that our moms and dads and aunts and uncles tend to take on, my mom's a nanny, my dad's in manufacturing, kind of lay the groundwork for the real wealth to be created in the United States. So it's not that I've always felt a part of this story of wealth in the US. We're just not the ones who kind of reap the benefits. So that's kind of been, to me, the big defining intersection of we're very much present in this idea of wealth and inequality within the US. We're just not a part of it.
Thanks, Jasmine. Who wants to pick it up from there?
I can share. I really loved Jasmine's like terminology of New American, because I think it really helped me to finally put a name to it of like, why do I feel oddly in between two different worlds? I grew up in a mixed status household, so I had undocumented parents for a bit of time. You know, my entire family was immigrants, and so I'm the first American to them. You know, really so handling the title of Korean American, and I think it ultimately caused a huge rift for me. The idea or the terms of wealth and equity were not a part of our vocabulary because it was not attainable to us. That was so far out there. Let's work on the daily problems we have today: our housing insecurity, our food insecurity, our lack of wages. I often remember hearing, growing up in a pretty predominantly immigrant town in Queens, where we had, you know, Polish immigrants to one side, Armenian immigrants, Puerto Rican immigrants across the street from us. Often, many of those folks talked about how they were the first fired, last hired. They were so dispensable in this society. So again, I think those are words certainly we knew were kind of out in the abyss, but we would never say it because it was never a reality that seemed possible. And so even now, you know, with the fortune and privilege I've had in my walk of life, I think it's still so hard to see myself thinking about those in terms of my own world and my realm of reality.
Thank you, Grace. How about Jenny and Kahlila? How did your identity impact the way you understand those things?
Yeah, I mean, me being African American, I've always understood that wealth wasn't meant for African Americans, especially when we talk about socioeconomical status. We know that African Americans were first seen as property dated back to 400, 500 years ago. And ever since then, we've always remained the lowest on the ladder. And so it's always been big for us when we see such an accomplishment from an African American who's the CEO of a business or who's doing so much for their community, because that means a lot. Because we know that that's not typically how things are supposed to be for us. And I see like that's a big deal, because with the new millennium and Gen Z generations, there's new meanings of wealth that have been like coming upon us, and at the same time it kind of holds us down, because it's, a lot of them are seeing like a lot of people actually being able to get out there, but in order to get out there, it's also like struggling to find employment and dealing with education. So yeah.
Yeah, and Kahlila, what do you see? Are there any like specific barriers that you see as you know, obstacles to maintaining wealth or accumulating wealth in the Black community?
Yeah, most definitely. It starts off young from like education, as far as when we see the school to prison pipeline, where African American students are policed more than their white students or other students around them, and they end up getting criminalized to the point where instead of getting an education, put in prison or kicked out of schools. And just in LA alone, African Americans represent 8% of the population at the Unified School District. However, we're 25% of the citations, arrests, and diversions. So we can see that there's a clear pipeline from us like being in school to prison, because we're getting criminalized more than our population, 5 times more than our population, and which this further prevents us from entering and finding employment within the workforce. And we know that this society really relies around having an education, a good education and degree, for finding a good place in the workforce.
Absolutely, that's real. And considering the school to prison pipeline is, super important when it comes to youth of color in schools that are policed. Thank you, Kahlila. Jenny?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack in this question, but I would say, my identity as a daughter of immigrant parents who came from El Salvador, and just having to, understanding wealth and equity, I don't think that was something that, as a child growing up in San Fernando, I don't think that was something that I really understood. I think, just having to navigate, I come from single mother and a grandmother who was also a single mother who didn't know how to read or write. She was only a Spanish speaker. So just having to be that person in my family to fill out forms for lunch tickets, and having to translate in appointments, and having to read prescriptions at age 10 is something that is, definitely influenced by my identity. I would also say, just growing up in an area where, this is just something I recently learned in Sun Valley, there was this article saying that the DW plant had a methane leak, and something I really thought of was, what does it mean for Black and Brown communities to be closer to power plants than community gardens and parks and grocery stores? So I think definitely the way I grew up really impacts the way that, I kind of see wealth and equity and wealth accumulation.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Jenny. All right, we can move into the second question. What is an asset of your generational perspective?
So I swear we try to say not the internet, but a lot of it does have to do with the internet and being very connected, and how we talked about this a little bit in preparation about how Black Lives Matter beautifully is a global movement. Its roots are here, right here in Los Angeles, but it is truly a global movement, and that's been an enormous tool that we have had, I think, for most of our lives, right? As this Millen-Z cohort is, we've really known folks across, from across the globe in nuanced ways. And that really leads to a lot of power for solidarity and for movement building. The flip side of that, right, which is not the question, I'm sorry, MacKenzie, which is not an asset, right, is that the internet's a fire hose. So I think we've also grown up to be very, doubtful is not the word I'm looking for, but there's so much online that you don't know what to trust. So there's that mix, having so much at your fingertips at any given moment can really lead to really positive things. But that also means that there can be a lot on there that isn't quite as trustworthy. And I think you just kind of become your own fact checker and filterer, and it's pretty overwhelming, and seeing everything that's going on to everybody all the time is definitely fatiguing. So I think, again, on the asset side, I think our generational cohorts have an enormous kind of potential for empathy and for compassion and for really connecting with folks who have lived very differently than they have. But the internet's a behemoth. And it's such a big part of our lives, like all of our lives now. So, well, not everyone. Then there's issues of equity there, right? And access. But I think that's been the biggest thing. I spend a lot of time on it. So I think that's probably the biggest thing to me that's definitive of our generational perspective.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Jasmine. Who else wants to jump in and ask that? Oh, thank you, Grace.
No problem. You know, I think, but I am for sure a like mom's girl. I think in kind of the theme of this summit, I fit really well into it. But first and foremost, I'm a grandma's girl. I think I'd probably grown up in a actually 4 generation household for a short period there. And really the culture I was raised in about respecting your elders, always considering the older generations before you, never forgetting that the road and the path that got you here and even parts of what is laid ahead is not by chance, but by the choices that people have made and the sacrifices. And so I really look up to a lot of people, whether it's, you know, familially and very from like intimate relationships of mentors, my first teachers who really did believe in me. So also remember the ones who really didn't as well, because English is my second language. I really struggled to learn English for the first few years of elementary school. But on a national stage, you know, naturally I'm drawn to women of color and women who may have had similar experiences like mine. And so activists like Grace Lee Boggs, for instance, was one of the very few Asian American women that I could really think about in books or in media and say, wow, there's someone out there who actually kind of gets me. We're not 100% the same, but I could finally see someone. But again, it was only that one and very few example too. But luckily, I think what it causes is the sense of courage and fearlessness, even more so than the generations before us, that I really can do it. I really can do even more than that. And I can call out people who are not helping others or causing more harm than others, that other generations may have had different struggles or adversities that they couldn't do.
Absolutely. Thank you, Grace.
To go off of that, I would say definitely an asset of my generational perspective is just having access to the things that I do. So in terms of like being a graduate of like a university, that's something that my family has never had access to. And, you know, something that my grandma would always tell me was that like you're in places that one dreamed of being. And I think that always just gets me so emotional because yeah, like we are, you know, part of like our family's like vision and dreams, and that's like a lot of pressure, but it's so like beautiful. And I would also say with that, I think that also encourages us to like lead and be led. So it's both like looking for help, but also like, you know, having like a hand like in your like just behind you and just like guiding other people also.
Yeah,
You,
going
Jenny.
back to like the topics of like ancestors, I definitely would say, especially for work around activism, it's very important to acknowledge your ancestors, the ones that come before us, especially in the African American community. We've seen the work that they've done, but we know that there's so much work left to do, especially because this fight is never over. This fight for racism and for equality, for justice, for change and democracy is never over. And so we know that we have to keep moving. But with our generation, like we've seen that this generation, especially Gen Z, has been so much more politically active, and we're not one of those there's no politics at the dinner table generations. Like we engage in those conversations that people don't want to have because they might be uncomfortable for some people, but we know that these are conversations that need to be had, especially during such a revolutionary time period of 2020, where we have an election year, but we also have a pandemic that's disproportionately affecting Black and Brown communities, as well as the rise in people realizing systematic racism and over policing in Black communities. So yeah, so as far as like my generation, I know for sure like Gen Z is kind of seen as like the saviors, because like, yes, we are more active and stay in the streets, and we're more like politically aware, um, but however, at the same time, like, there's only so much that a person can do. So that does put a lot of like high pressure barriers, especially for African American women, because in my fight there's a lot of African American women, so it's hard to just like deal with everything, as far as like meeting expectations with the challenges and barriers that are already there.
Absolutely, Kahlila. And I feel like I do hear a lot that the younger generations are like the saviors, or it's in our hands now. But, I do hear for the burnout, like you're only 16, you're in these streets, like you're on People magazine, you're doing all this great work, but it can't be, it's not sustainable to leave it, just to the people that are affected the most. So, that's real.
Yeah. Yeah, because like, especially like with trauma and everything, like, it seems like every week now you turn on the news and there's another name on TV. But for a lot of African Americans, we're kind of numb to hearing another name, because this is really not nothing new for us. We've seen this before. And like, their stories are repetitive situations, and we've been hearing these stories for years. And so like the trauma and anxiety that comes with living as a target in society, where we know that we're over policed, and then like there's the issue of police brutality, systematic racism, and then for that savior perspective, like, oh well, they're gonna save us, this is gonna be the generation that makes change and is gonna do so much for us, we're gonna do what we can. But like at the same time, like putting all that pressure is a lot, because especially for a lot of African Americans, we have the trauma and anxiety that we have to live with on our own.
Yeah. Thank you, Kahlila. All right, we're going to move on to the third question, and I'll make sure it goes in the chat. Our third question is going to be, what is your vision for the future, both for young women of color in organizing and professional spaces, and for the world beyond?
I really resonated with what Kahlila just mentioned about trauma, not just the ones we already have to carry, but the weight of so many more others who are really looking onto us. I think often when I feel frozen by that anxiety, many folks in my life always remind me that perfection is the enemy of progress. And it's really, to me, a reminder of just take that one step forward. Just do the one small thing today. You don't have to change the world every second that you're breathing and living, because ultimately that is a bit of that pressure. I think a lot of folks, what I'm hearing, or at least what I identify with, feeling. And so I really hope that, as I mentioned, like mentors and like leaders I've seen before me, but there's basically only that one person. I could look beyond like my immediate family or my immediate community. Like I would love to see more representation and less tokenization of that one, role model for any woman of color, whatever their identity, their race, their creed they identify with. So that you don't have to be so caught up on this perfection idea. I really think about particularly growing up and starting to be exposed to, especially like my white friends and white affluent friends, and particularly white boys, like they really, could do anything. They could be doctors, they could be CEOs, they could be business owners, they could be engineers, like you name it, there's probably someone out there who is a leader that they could go find very easily. And I think to me, though I was always given kind of those types of encouragements, it didn't seem possible. It didn't seem almost logical. Similar to kind of the first question about wealth and equity, like those weren't words we ever used, because it doesn't make any sense. Like those aren't things we're ever going to achieve. So why bother kind of dreaming that big? That seems a little too high. And so I would love to see like women here continue to lift up and be examples, and it really uphold that kind of fearlessness, so that, the others after us don't have to be so bogged down, I think, to be the epitome of the next big thing, because there are already so many great examples ahead of them that they can now just progress even further in that mission or that goal.
Absolutely, Grace. And when we talk about tokenization, it's a good time to kind of plug the Slate for Justice, because tokenization is a construction. You know, it's constructed that we see only one or two people that look like us in these, you know, upper echelons or these higher spaces because of things like, you know, affirmative action being banned. That's how we create things like tokenization and having no role models and et cetera. So it's coming up on the ballot this fall in, you know, 30 something days. So let's get affirmative action back in California. Michelle's ready with coffee. Jasmine?
Yeah, I mean, to echo everything that Grace is saying, and even drawing on the answers from the last questions, all of us are standing on the shoulders of giants, like giants, because they were women of color. So you have to be extra gigantic to succeed in these spaces. And I know we all have, you know, notorious examples that we can pull from. And then we also have the millions more within our own families and communities that most of the world will never know, that are the ones, you know, that you cry to when you're frustrated. So there's a lot of people that we owe a lot to. So it's scary to think about, how do you become the next generation, you know, that's gonna uphold, because the work needs to keep going. I'm so sorry. But on all of this note, there's so much more to do. I think what I envision for the future is going beyond kind of diversity panel diversity, which is what my manager and I like to call it, where everybody has the 2 or 3 people that they can send out to the diversity panel and then hide behind for the rest of the year. So we need to do much, much better than diversity panel diversity. And same with tokenization, that all goes hand in hand. We need more than the one Black member of the staff, the one Latinx member of the staff. That's not enough, because if you're making decisions with a majority, that's not going to work. So I really hope that we can keep kind of bringing people into these spaces, and we've seen it. We've seen it over the last year in the resistance against the administration, right? Like, authenticity matters, and we need to make the professional spaces we're in, the organizing spaces we're in, whatever it is, like, open to authenticity. And we need to do away with these old school, white-centric ideas of what's professional and what you bring into the workplace and what you bring into your movement space and what we can air on television. We just need to open our minds up to it and realize that power comes from our authenticity, and we just need to demand the platform for it, not change it to buck to their platform. So
yeah, thank you, Jasmine. And, you know, being in funding spaces, is there anything that you've seen that has like challenged, you know, what we're talking about today, or we can start to disrupt, you know, the barriers?
Yes, there actually are some very, very exciting things happening. Again, giant shoulders that all of this work is happening on top of. But within philanthropy, right, it's a weird space, because we are very much a symptom of inequity, but we are kind of treated as a solution to it. And I think we need to do a bit more reckoning with the fact that we are also a symptom of wealth inequality in this country, right? So how can you be the solution and the problem at the same time? I think we need to ask some tougher questions in that space. But looking at how, I want to say it's about 8% of philanthropic dollars actually make it out to communities of color. I think most people on this call could agree that that would not be happening if there were more people of color on staff, on boards, especially within philanthropy. So some foundations are now asking, I'm very proud to say, for the very first time on our applications, asking about your board demographics and your board makeup, and how many women are on there, how many non-binary folks are on there. What is your board completely white? It's something that we should take into account for, and it's a lens that we should use when we're looking at the solutions that you're proposing to be funded. So I am very excited that there is sort of a tide change within the field. But again, we can always do so much more.
Thank you, Jasmine.
Yeah.
Kahlila or Jenny, what is your vision for the future?
My vision for the future, definitely being in activism work. I know that like there's a lot of females within the work that I do, so I love seeing women in the work that I'm in. So like just that continuance of like seeing women in like activism, and it's inspiring, especially like seeing, because me growing up, the only person that I ever saw that looked like me, um like that was really known out there was like when I read a book about Ruby Bridges. Like other than that, like I had to learn on my own because that's stuff that they're not teaching a lot of the students. And so it's inspiring to work with these Black women who are making a difference, and being on the covers of like magazines and billboards, and like being known as like the most influential people of the in Times Magazine, and like there's so much going on that it's so powerful to see. And like as like stated before by MacKenzie, like these generations are the most ethnically and racially diverse. And so when we think about those races that we say when we say ethnically diverse, in this midst of this revolutionary time period, we know that many are calling for the defunding of police, and many are like calling for like they're calling for like the defunding of police and reimagining public safety and over policing of Black communities. And I think that's important to really look at, because we know that Black and brown communities, especially Black communities, are highly targeted by police, and that includes in schools as well. But as I said before, the school to prison pipeline, just the school police in our schools that are supposed to be there for safety, but when there's not an incident on our campuses, which God forbid there be like a school shooting, which everybody comes back to, like that's why we have police in our schools. But in the meantime, what they're doing is targeting Black students and Muslim students, and putting us in this group of people to be profiled and victimized and criminalized. So I think it's important for me, like when I talk about like the future, like I really want to see like continuance of these young women fighting for justice, as well as like people really starting to think of other ways of public safety and other ways that we can think of safety for the generations after us, so that they won't have to deal with the trauma and anxiety that many of us deal with in these generations.
Thanks, Kahlila. Jenny?
Yeah, so I would say my vision for the future is the healing of childhood trauma and intergenerational cycles. I think also, like Kahlila mentioned, so many women in advocacy spaces, community organizing spaces. I think with that comes a lot of making sure that we're protecting each other, so protecting women in these spaces, because some of these spaces can be used as like predatory spaces. And so protecting Black, brown women, queer, trans, disabled people, I think is super important. Holding each other accountable with like toxic masculinity, internalized machismo, and all of that. I think it's a lot of the work that we have to do. I would also say just, making sure we're in this for the right reasons, that we are, again, representing communities, we're representing our families, and, just like who we are doing this work for. And then I have a lot. I would say challenging professionalism is, which I think we are, to do. And then also just hospital executive leadership boards, researchers, providers and decision makers who are representative of our communities. So, right, if the majority of our hospital is seeing Black, Brown, low-income patients, who is our executive leadership board? Who is running the town halls? So yeah, that's a hope that I see in the future, that we will get there.
Thanks, Jenny. And two things that stuck out to me, and I can open this up to the rest of the panel, are, you know, notions of professionalism and accountability. So I feel like we should maybe talk a little bit more about that. Like, how do you think professionalism, especially for young women of color, can function sometimes as a weapon in professional spaces? And also accountability, like what do you find, or what do you identify as effective means of holding people accountable? Because, you know, cancel culture exists, but, you know, it's getting disputed all the time. How effective is it? It may work to push a person out of a particular place or doing harm, but what is to say that person's not going to pick a new space to replicate the same harm again? Like, how can we truly be holding people accountable?
I mean, I think a lot of it is really looking at the roots of how we run, even the notion of like a nonprofit or an organization, or how we approach decision making. I even gave an example right off the top of my head of like a 50% majority. That's only one way to do it, but I think we take it for granted that it's the only way to do it. There's different forms of providing community services. We can all look back to our families. I also come from an immigrant parent background. Things got done in their communities in radically different ways. There are different ways to approach solutions. People have developed for centuries community-centered approaches because that's just how we used to do things. So I think unpacking, you know, just the way we run organizations is not a given, and the way we approach government is not a given, the way we approach public services, the way we approach, you know, the stratification of wealth, the way we approach decision making. Do we need to have a board? Obviously that's a crazy hypothetical, but just really being critical about why we do things, and that it's not a natural order that's here of the earth. It's all a system that's been created to serve very specific purposes, and then start unpacking it, because it's not written in some grand, you know, manifesto that this is the way things need to be done. And I think that all trickles down to what we see as appropriate, what we see as professional, what we see, again, as the right way to do things. I think we need to be very critical of the history of organizations and just the concept of how we make decisions, and really think about who it's functioning to serve. Even something like the nonprofit industrial complex, right? Like, there is a middle class that is born out of nonprofit administration. Who is the majority in that middle class? So I think we really need to be critical about the way we do things and the way we kind of engineer solutions to problems, because it was in the hands of folks for a very long time in the past, right? When it was maybe not legal for us to be in the workforce. So I think really going back to our history is one of the ways we need to approach ideas of professionalism and kind of a path forward.
Thanks, Jasmine. All right, unless anyone's got anything else to say, we can move on to the fourth question, which is, how does your current work impact the way you think about wealth and equity? So I know we've touched on a lot of things, but pose that.
I forgot to unmute myself quickly enough. This is, I think, my elder millennial showing. But one thing I did want to plug was that the House just passed, this is me being a policy wonk, but the House just passed the Crown Act, which makes it illegal for any employer across the country. If it passes the Senate, everyone pray for it, but make it illegal for any employer to discriminate someone based on their natural hair or their hairstyle. And so I think when we think about professionalism, and I completely agree with what the other panelists have been talking about, upholding constant whiteness of professionalism rather than the reality of the diversity of folks who make up the workforce and predominantly are a minority majority. It's these types of markers I think we're continually seeing in the world happen that gives me hope at the end of the day for the future, that it is continuing. There's still a lot of things out there, but we can still start to make progress towards it. I think in my current work, as I said, I work on advocacy and legislative analysis. And so to me, having been once on the outside, having been that statistic, that data point, I have asthma because I grew up in a low-income neighborhood next to a power plant, next to sewage. And so when I think about, great, I'm just another one in the data, and ultimately that's all that's done is really further harm BIPOC communities, my communities, I think it makes me hyper aware, really hypersensitive to what I do every single day. The things I say when I'm advocating for something, the things I'm analyzing or researching in data, that I ultimately, the privilege I have now to be on the inside to create change, hopefully, you know, it's not causing unintended harm down the road. And I think similar to what we were talking about earlier about this sort of burden that we all feel to be perfect, to make all the changes possible in the world, to not let our ancestors down and not to harm further these institutions by letting things go as is. It is by calling people out, but in a way that is truly equitable, because words are just words without meaning if ultimately the implementation of that or the impact of that really does cause further harm. I think a lot about intent versus impact and questioning others, questioning myself when we say we want racial justice, we want racial equity, and you start to read through some of the guidelines of what a piece of legislation might say or what this organization is putting out for you to join their coalition. Is that truly the right way to do it? Is that truly making sure we're not excluding and further harming our most marginalized or most underinvested communities? So yeah, it's a lot, but you know, I think it's better than saying, let's just do it to check the box. Let's make sure we put out our BLM statement because everyone else says we don't get left behind. You know, everyone's so concerned about being on the right side of justice, on the right side of history. But at the end of the day, I think, especially having spoken to predominantly white-led organizations during this period in DEI work, diversity, equity, and inclusion work, to me, the discomfort and the question I always put onto them is, are you just doing this because you want to look good? You know, you want to make sure your brand has that nice little infographic on Instagram out there for the likes? Or do you actually believe in what you're trying to say? Do you actually believe in the words of your CEO's press release that you just put out?
Thank you, Grace. Yeah, so anyone else for how your current work impacts the way you like think or look at wealth and equity?
So I will speak on this just in terms of my work. I am currently working with patients in Boston. So I would say, you know, a lot of the things that I've been seeing is a lot of food inequality. So that's one of the biggest things where mothers are not having enough food, enough money to buy formula, enough money for their children, having to sacrifice paying certain things so that they can have food on the table. And so I guess, you know, just working with a lot of patients who are having a really, really hard time right now. There's, you know, mothers who don't have internet access. So then remote schooling is not a possibility. And then there's also people who are living in unsafe housing situations. So I spoke with a mother who said that there's roaches in her apartment and she's worried about her child's health and that, you know, she can't sleep at night because she's thinking about how she's gonna get through this. And so, you know, some of the things that we're able to do is connecting the resources for food. We're helping with, you know, connection for the food pantry and gift cards, but that always feels kind of like a bandage solution because what happens next month when they need food again? And so, you know, I think that just shows the inequities that a lot of Black and Brown mothers have to go through. And Also here in California, how they were trying to pass AB 826 and to give undocumented immigrants extra food access, right? A lot of these people who are working in the field in Central Valley, who are working through wildfires, bad air quality, a pandemic, and don't have enough food, like the basic necessities that you need. So that's currently my work, and it's frustrating at times because it feels like we need more policy changes. It's not, there's bandage solutions can only do so much, but working with these mothers, a lot of them are just so grateful just to even get a call, and like they're so grateful that someone is trying to advocate for them. So yeah, that's how my current work is impacted.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. And when you say Band-Aid solution, it brings me back to the results we heard earlier on the Price of Motherhood panel, where, we learned that in South LA, Black and brown mothers reported being an average of about $450 short every single month. And, what does one gift card in 1 month really do to, ameliorate that? And, I want to open up to the rest of the panelists. Have you heard of any kind of like long-term, more sustainable interventions or programming that challenges a Band-Aid, solution that is more sustainable and could really have some strong long-term impact?
I mean, I wish we could go this panel without talking about the current administration, but a lot does need to begin at the federal level and that type of help, right? So, right, philanthropy can only do so much, community groups can only do so much, nonprofit. Not that there isn't a lot to do, but I think it really, like, right, they're $10 problems, like these need to be $10 solutions. Like we cannot keep throwing pennies at these problems. So I think a lot of mobilizing, I mean, I'm very grateful. I don't know that I've seen, like, I'm very excited about the energy there is around voting for this election, but I do think a lot of it is going to come from the policy side, from what we can get passed, especially again at the federal level, and what's actually going to reach as many households as possible. And I think we need to acknowledge that if you're contributing to this country, you should be eligible for these things. So I think really mobilizing around making sure that the undocumented community is just as much a part of these conversations about assistance, and that we really, because it's for, right, no, it doesn't help anybody to cut out a group that's already incredibly vulnerable in this country from assistance. So I do think we need to look at the policy side a lot more, which is why I'm very grateful that people like Grace exist in the world.
Thank you, Jasmine.
I would definitely say, like, as far as like in the activism work, like things that can start by change is like the passage of Prop 15, which increase money in schools. That would bring a lot of money into schools by taxing large corporations. We see like a lot of these large corporations aren't paying their taxes and aren't paying their fair share, and then as well as that are contributing to police unions that continue to over police these communities, as well as health and safety. They're not they're over, like, for example, Chevron and El Segundo is over polluting the local neighboring community, and many people don't talk about that. And Chevron isn't paying taxes either, and they're paying for the opposition of Prop 15 because they want to keep lining their pockets, as well as funneling money to Donald Trump and police unions. And these large corporations they need to start being called out, as well as like start with that passage of Prop 15, and make sure that like these large corporations as well stop the money that they're funneling to these organizations that are contributing to policing and harming the communities around them.
Thank you, Kahlila. And I know we're almost out of time and we got to wrap up, but I just want to throw one last question out there. What keeps you up at night?
I think for me, I definitely would say like what keeps me up at night is like knowing everything that's going on in society. Um, like not only like trauma and anxiety and like with school being online with Zoom and everything, there's like a lot like going on as far as like having to complete like a lot of work because the assignments are just harder being at home. But also it's like being Black, like that target from society in general, especially like knowing that like I literally just seen in the news how there was a woman literally sleeping in her own home who didn't get justice for being shot in her own home. And like all she was doing was sleeping. And it's like there's not, every Black person has tried everything. They've tried to jog down the street, they've tried to go get Skittles from the local store, they've tried to sleep in their own homes and play video games in their home, and it's everything they have been shot for. So I think like that's probably what most keeps me up at night, is like the worry of like it, like what's gonna happen as I go to sleep, or like the future, like when you are asked questions like where do you see yourself in 5 years or a year from now, and it's like there's always that uncertainty because it's like, will I be here in 5 years or a year? Like we don't know. And so yeah.
Thank you, Kahlila.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that Kahlila feels that there's doubt behind whether or not she'll be around in 5 years would be something that keeps me up at night. The fact that there's been such a targeting of specific communities for no reason. And just the fact that we haven't progressed as much as I think we want to have had, especially in the last 4 years or so, 3 years or so. So I think the fact that sometimes it feels like our country's leadership is moving us a step backwards is really concerning. Climate change is worrisome as well. I think there's, again, a lot of these massive issues that now feel like they're really on the horizon in terms of just geography. But I think just how much work there is to be done is the biggest part.
Thanks, Jasmine.
Yeah, I echo, I think, the crux of what we all talked about throughout this hour together, just a lot of the weight and thoughts, just ideas even, positive to make change, but there's just a lot happening. And I think I know we talked to us a little bit recently with the four of us together, but like literally, I think a phone and having like just unlimited access to news and media and information, ultimately you never shut off that side of thinking. And I think just the physicality of that too, just literally can't like fall asleep because I have like 14 different voices in my head right now talking about this, that, what, questioning this, that, or make sure to remember to do this tomorrow, or what have you.
Thanks, Grace. All right. Well, if Jenny doesn't want to add, do you want to add to the what keeps you up at night?
Yeah, I mean, I would say a lot of what has been said is, definitely a lot of what keeps me up at night. I think a lot of, children and youth in our generation also having to deal with a lot of anxiety and like sleepless nights, which is just super concerning, right? But yeah, I would say, I guess in terms of like, I guess a positive like note or something, like having, you know, some ideas. Like sometimes I can't say because I'm having so many ideas and they're just like, I'm like, how am I gonna do this? You know, but yeah, I would say those things.
Thank you, Jenny. Well, that concludes our Millen-Z panel, and I want to thank the 4 wonderful women who joined me today and, you know, contributed to this planning process and shared a lot of great ideas, but, you know, also things that are on our minds. So thank you so much, guys.